I've been pondering a question for about 4 days now, and I thought I would share with you what I think some of my answers are to it. And the question is, and I include the words self-help, self-awareness and self-love relatively interchangeably here, but why is that so difficult? Why is self-awareness, self-love, and being aware of your inner self and believing in that so difficult? And why might that be more difficult for men than women? I've come up with, I think, 3 answers. Some of them personal, and some of them maybe observational. And I wondered if I might share them with you today on this video. So what do you think? Why is self-awareness, self-love, anything to do with ourselves, our inner selves, difficult? And why might it be difficult for men? And I'm going to do this whilst I walk into town. So I have to be aware of my surroundings, which is quite amusing, isn't it, when I think about it? Right now, being aware of my surroundings as I walk. So let's just ponder something. The first thing, what were the messages growing up for you as a child? As a young boy, as a teenage boy? What were the messages that you heard? What were the messages I heard? In school, it was always about the future. If you do this, you'll get this. And when you get this, you'll have a life and you'll be happy. So if you do well at these subjects, you could choose them for options at age 11. I was devastated when I didn't do so well in my SATs. I was the first year to do SATs back in, I think, 1992. Felt like I was cheated out of the wrong mark, doing the wrong paper. And it meant that I couldn't go into the top group for science, I think, if I remember rightly. But it was devastating for me at the time, and it felt wrong. But as I look back at school, for one example, as a place that was important to me growing up, what were the messages? School was about the future. School was about learning subjects in a variety of ways to be able to pass exams and get grades to go on to the next stage, which would be something like university or college, whatever future life would be, and school was meant to prepare. It was about intelligence, the kind of intelligence that was academic and educational. I'm just going to stop here. But it was about an external thing, it was about personal achievement. In fact, I think I've seen doing the rounds on some of the social media recently, that thing about our personal achievement folder, that bright purple leather folder that many of us had when we were growing up in our schools in the 90s. So what were the messages from school? It wasn't about believing, maybe it was about believing in yourself a little bit. It wasn't necessarily about trusting in our inner self. It was about what you can achieve and what you can do. And I think that, and there was all other messages too from other parts of society. So one of them was also for me, was in church. And that was also an organisation that had a system of beliefs and things that made you acceptable or not acceptable, about things that conditioned behaviour, and that they had a certain effect on the way I thought about myself. So what are the messages you hear from church, from faith groups when you're growing up, if you had at all? And then I think there's another thing, and I think all these 3 things are just about the same thing, actually. But the other thing is the the, the question about as men and as men specifically, we often have this thought that somebody else is going to save us and we want something else. So maybe it is about the grades or degrees or letters after our name and those things. But the other thing is that we often can become very easily hooked into hobbies and interests. And often that can include sports teams and like other hobbies that are about achievement, and other hobbies that are about participation, but also about following the life and the culture of that particular sport. And we follow a team through its ups and its downs, and its highs and its lows, and its in between moments, and its changes of manager, and all those kind of things. And in a way, we expect something from an organisation, a culture, that to affect each and every one of us, and it does, because we're often much more addicted by the drama than we are by the happy moments. It has an effect on us. Disappointed in every defeat, maybe more than we praise every victory, although I wish I was at the 99 treble winning parade through Manchester, but those moments can be fleeting and take a long time to get to that point. So I think one of the reasons is the belief in the external. To think that one of the things that we as men can invest a lot of energy in is the external things. And those are things about our own achievements, and the belief that that will help us or make us happy in and putting ourselves and investing ourselves into things like leadership or into places of serving other people in places like religious organisations. Growing up, that's what I did and have still done to some extent. And also our hobbies, it's all about the external. It's about wanting somebody else, whether that's those things, to save us. And it's kind of a pattern, isn't it? So that's one of the things that I think causes issues with self-care and self-love for men specifically. I'm now walking under a tree and it's dark, and I haven't adjusted the settings on my camera for a reason. I wonder whether a second thing that stops us becoming more self-aware is those very organisations themselves deliberately don't want us to be aware, because they're scared of what might happen if we do become aware. So if we become aware of ourselves and we can love ourselves, does it mean that organisation, whether that's a football club, a church, political organisation, does that mean it can't control us or take something from us in a way that it maybe could have done before, because we know who we are? So if we invest in that organisation, if we invest in that kind of culture, whether it's emotionally, spiritually, what that might do is draw us into their drama, but also delegitimise the very thing that will save us, which is ourselves and our inner self, and it takes our attention away. I've heard things like self-awareness, that's just a new age thing, or for guys it can be things like, oh, that's just a woman's thing, or only soft people do that. Sounds a bit like third age or new age or mystical, and you don't want to believe that. I've even heard conversations within football clubs or football chat that sitting around after a game, being able to process what went wrong in a game as some kind of therapy. Now, it probably is therapeutic to some degree, but is it therapy that causes us to look at our inner self, causes us to look at our frustrations and what it is that we're taking or needing from sport in that moment? And it can be dangerous to confuse the two, I think. But I think what I'm getting at is the very places and organisations that we've invested in, as men often, keep us in the dark and delegitimise and criticise or defend themselves, or try and put that voice, that critical voice, back in our heads. But that's not a good thing to do, or you don't want to do that. That could lend you into whole loads of places. Well, really? I see. So there's something about being deliberately being kept in the dark. I'm going to stand by this tree, by those very organisations. Because those organisations want something from us. A football club might want us to be a member and invest money. A church the same. And potentially those people in there are scared that if we find a different way of thinking about ourselves, they might lose us. We might stop becoming a fan of a club, or we might stop believing everything that's said in a faith group like the Bible about who we are. And especially we might not think of ourselves as sinful or full of shame. And that brings me on to my third point, and I'm going to walk into the light now. But I thought it was important to recognise that often the very organisations that we invest in, or have invested in, can delegitimise the process for us of being aware of who we are and our not just our potential, but our inner core being, because that's often been the place, the battleground for that faith group, whether it's Christianity or whatever it might be, because again we've wanted to invest in that external to save us, and when it hasn't done that, or only does that on a level, it has to delegitimise every other way that could happen. And I wonder if those are the two reasons why self-care, self-help can be difficult for us as men, maybe specifically. And so the first one was about external things, believing in external things. And the second was that those external things can often delegitimise the very path of discoveries that we need to make to be better as humans, to be better as men, to be vulnerable. I remember in Brené Brown's TED talk on vulnerability, it's a great watch, do have a watch of it, and she talks about vulnerability, and a man comes up to her and says, I know, I understand everything that you've said, but if I tried to do this at home, my wife would laugh at me, and my wife would just say, don't be so ridiculous. And I'm grateful to be married to Christelle, who supports my discoveries and my learning in a very deep and profound way, and I'm very much grateful. But can you see what happened there in that action? In a way, that man's wife was scared of a man being vulnerable and going on a path of self-discovery, and yet the man probably had invested his external emotional being at one point in being married, having kids, and that was the path to being happy, and all of a sudden he was about to change and brought awareness to light, and yet it may not have been safe for him to do so. Can you see that? It's interesting, isn't it? Have a watch of the TED Talk, Brené Brown, on vulnerability. It's one of the famous ones, and you'll see this interaction. I think it's really interesting. So that external thing wants to keep us as we are, whether that's the football club, the sports club, the faith group, even like the family, in terms of that interaction, because it wants to control us. So that brings me on to the third one, is what do we have to be then in that place where we've been controlled by that faith group, that external thing. What kind of person, what kind of beliefs about ourselves do we maintain at the point where that's the way it is? I mean, we might hear things like, well, that's just the way it is, you have to put up with it, or I can't change, so, and I'm not going to. What happens at that point to ourselves? So I think the third one is the third important message. It's not really a message, it's just an observation. And I think as I was walking this morning, I could think of the first two quite easily. But when this third one arrived, I thought it was even more profound. So I'm going to sit down and then share that with you. The third thing is I think we're afraid of ourselves. I think we hide so much. We think we're horrible. We've been made to believe that we're bad. We've been made to believe to be at fault for things that possibly weren't our fault. We feel bad about the things that we know we did do, that we should have done, shouldn't have done, and certainly the things we should have done better at. We know that we didn't take responsibility when we could have done. So we're afraid of what we might find. We're afraid that once we open that can, the worms are going to fall out, and they're going to be dirty, stinky worms, and we're not going to be loved, and no one's going to, we feel shame and guilt, so it's better to keep the lid on the box. So we're afraid of ourselves, and we're afraid because we've been conditioned to think that we might be sinful and guilty, and that we don't deserve love, we don't deserve forgiveness, we don't deserve to be able to accept ourselves for who we are. And so we run away and hide. It's a bit like that old story, wasn't it? Adam ran away and hid because he was afraid. He did something wrong. He ran because he hid and he was afraid. So I think we can internalize the legitimacy of thinking about ourselves because it's easier that way. It's easier to be afraid of ourselves. It's easier to carry on pretending, isn't it? What's that doing to you? What does that do to me? What happens when we bring our own things to the light? We bring our own things to the place of safety. What if we, instead of running, we learn to face them gently? We learn to turn our face and face ourselves and realise that we can believe ourselves when we hear the message that you are enough and you deserve to be loved, and not be afraid of ourselves. We might want to react to, but I did this, and but I did that, but I did, and you did all those things, and so did I. That was then. This is now. How do you respond when somebody points something out to you? Do you defend yourself? Do you accept yourself? Do you run away and hide and beat yourself up? Who are you afraid of when you do? What are you afraid of when you do? So I think, and I put myself in this category, I was afraid of myself. Not just what I was capable of, but of the worms that might come crawling out. So what did I do instead? Put layer upon layer upon layer over the top. Protect, hide, pretend, mask. So we could blame the organisation, we could blame the way we got brought up, we could blame the messages that we heard, we can blame even ourselves for internalising those messages. But in another way, we kind of half wanted to, or we had no choice to. It doesn't have to always be like that, though. It doesn't have to always be a place that you're afraid of. You are not to be afraid of the closer you are to the things that are painful and hurt. If you're thinking things if you're thinking that you're guilty and thinking that you have shame, and that's the place your mind is tormenting you to, then stop. Stop thinking. Give yourself time. Look at something else. Breathe. Notice your body. Notice the trees, the leaves. Notice the squirrels. Notice something, the birds around. Just notice something that isn't dramatic, that is just doing its thing, because that's what it's doing. Just look at it and smile and breathe. And know that whatever you've done, it can be redeemed. You have the possibility to actually change. You don't have to be afraid of yourself and the consequences of looking at yourself and realising who you are. Imagine what it'd be like to not be afraid of yourself. Imagine what it'd be like to be able to trust yourself, to love yourself. Imagine. And what will happen then to the love you have for your partner, for your children? What would happen then when you realised who you are and your core being was much more still and much more healed and much more full of love than being afraid and fearful, cynical and mistrusting? Because that's the easy place to be. Can you be courageous and start to love yourself and not be afraid of yourself? What would that look like for you today? Could start with the small things. Small moment to consciously remember that you are important. Small moment to treat yourself, because you're allowed to treat yourself. You're allowed to give yourself space. You're allowed to think of yourself as important in your core being. Not important so you destroy somebody else. That's not you being important. That's not you valuing yourself. That's you and your ego out of control. But you're allowed to be still. You're allowed to listen. You're allowed to trust your heart and yourself. You really are. It's time to doubt the messages. It's time to listen and doubt and act and respond to them in a way that is from you, because you have a voice that can say to them, I don't need to listen to you anymore. I don't need to believe you anymore. So maybe this is a follow-up from last week, since I stopped believing in myself, or believe in myself. But ultimately it's the same thing, isn't it? We can only talk to ourselves in a positive way once we stop being frightened of ourselves and afraid of ourselves, and we love ourselves. So why is self-love and self-awareness difficult? Because actually we're not conditioned to think that it's something we should do until it's maybe something too late, till it's a crisis. And I get it, I really do. But up until that point we're just afraid. At least I was. Because I was afraid of what would happen if I did start to realise who I was. 3 things. Why self-love is difficult. Today's video. Thank you for watching.